Welcome back. We now are going to talk about the first of our three tragic playwrights, Euripides. The curious thing about the way the book arranges the three playwrights is that actually Euripides is chronologically the last of the three. So we'll still take him in the order that the book presents us, but you should make sure that you're aware that Euripides, in fact, of the three, is actually the latest of the three tragic playwrights. The most likely reason why the book did it this way is that the play that you read for today, Bacchae, is one of the most demonstrative plays for the way that Greek tragedy was written, especially the way that Dionysus takes full stage. We'll talk about Bacchae at the end of this video for a little bit. Take a note that we have our cup of wine once again, so we know that something in the way of order is going to be disturbed. By now you've read that in Bacchae, and you know that the order of thieves is very greatly disturbed, sometimes in some rather sanguinary ways. Let's first, however, talk about Euripides. His dates are given to us as 485 to 406 BC. We're not sure of the 485 exactly, but the 406 BC is definite. We actually do not know too much about his own personal background, but he did come into the mockery of Aristophanes, the comic playwright, quite a bit. One of the points made against him was that Euripides was the son of a vegetable saleswoman, someone who would have gone into the agora, the marketplace in Athens, to sell vegetables. That would have been rather disgraceful, both because it suggests how poor the family was, and also because women were not supposed to have to go out and work. They were supposed to remain at home. We can't really tell whether this was true or not. It seems unlikely, because as you heard about in the previous video, there was a lot involved with the creation of tragedy. In fact, the tragic playwright was responsible for getting all the preparations ready for his tragic production, including having to pay for various services like the chorus and such. He had to train the choruses, he had to write all the music. That would have taken quite a bit of money, so it's unlikely really that Euripides could have been all that poor. In any event, we know that he did live at Athens for most of his life, but in the last couple of years, he left Athens and went up north to Macedonia, which is on the curve of the Aegean Sea in the northwest corner. And it's really considered the last portion of that whole peninsula that's considered to be very loosely part of Greece. But really, it's really almost like the hinterlands at that point. And Euripides went up there and wrote tragedies for the king of Macedon, and eventually died out there. Stories went around that Euripides was so unhappy at the way his tragedies were received in Athens that he finally just bailed out and moved away because he was frustrated. It doesn't seem that likely because, in fact, Euripides was probably as much an honored tragic playwright as the other two. The fact that he was getting choruses from the state, which had to be specially granted by the state, seems to suggest that he was probably, in fact, quite successful. And the fact that his plays weren't winning is probably suggestive of the audience as much as the plays themselves. So it's probably not likely that Euripides left quite that way. But that is the story that is given to us. So his bio shows that he did live a pretty lengthy life, and he did write quite a few plays. About 90 of them altogether are given to us in names by the various manuscripts and sources that we have. And we are not exactly sure of all the names as to whether, in fact, they are legitimately his. It's a little bit difficult when dealing with these kinds of sources because we never can tell whether plays might have been ascribed to an author that were not actually his. But we have these names. Now, there were a group of later literary collectors, referred to as anthologists, who apparently went through the surviving works at that time. This would be about 1st to 2nd century AD, and culled out works that they did not feel were suitable for the author. There might have been something of a religious aspect to this. When that happened, Aeschylus ended up being trimmed down to 7 plays, Sophocles also down to 7 plays, and Euripides was going to be down to 10, but then an additional 9 plays managed to survive sort of secretly afterwards. So as a result, we actually have 19 plays of Euripides, and therefore have more plays of his than of the other two tragic playwrights. So those are given to you on your handout. I won't list them here, but the two that you were reading for this course are Bacchae, which was today's play, and then next week, Euripides' play, Medea. So Euripides was very blunt in the way that he presented human nature. It may be one of the reasons why his plays were not entirely successful at Athens. In fact, according to our sources, of the 90 plays or so that he wrote, only 4 of them actually got first place. One of them actually got first place after he died, and it's this play, Bacchae. This play was produced in 406 BC in Athens when news of Euripides' death had just arrived. So he won first place. He had a very traditional approach, especially the way that Dionysus is presented as a character, because here Dionysus is partly representative of the art of theater as well as the character in his own story. You may remember that the theories about the origin of tragedy suggest that Dionysus' story may have been at the heart of how tragedy was originally constructed, with one character or actor who would have been playing out Dionysus, and then a whole group of other people accompanying him as the chorus and singing the ritual dithyramb in his honor. So this chorus here and the character of Dionysus essentially are a throwback. You have to remember that 406 BC is very late in the production of tragedy. So this was a throwback to some of tragedy's origins, and it appears to have been very successful for the Athenians, and they liked it. And of course, Dionysus is an incredibly forbidding figure, especially in that opening prologue of his. It was probably that reason why one of my students in a previous class referred to him as Kick-Ass, very appropriately. So, Bacchae was one of only 4 plays that actually won for Euripides. And again, one of the reasons perhaps why that was so is that Euripides wrote in what later scholars call the low style, in contrast to the middle and high styles that we'll talk about more with Aeschylus and Sophocles in the next couple of days. The low style essentially stated that Euripides was writing humans as they actually are. So therefore, the unvarnished truth, all of the various blemishes and moral faults and weaknesses of character are all displayed right there in front of the audience. And that's a little disconcerting, because it means that there isn't a lot of redemption that comes from the stories. Now, Aristotle's Poetics has in it the theory of catharsis, which is the cleansing aspect of tragedy, which is to say that one is supposed to feel pity and fear and other emotions too in response to tragedy, and then eventually get cleansed of those. Now, we can't really be sure whether Euripides' plays always would have carried this out, because sometimes the effect of the tragedy and the way that these characters behave is so disgusting, to be perfectly blunt about it, that you can't necessarily feel any real moral lesson. You almost come away with a feeling of cynicism that this is human nature the way it is, and it's always going to be like this way, so we just have to view an example of it and accept it the way it is. So low style, as I say, is very blunt, very direct, and not really very forgiving as far as what the possible outcome of that particular tragedy might be. So again, it's very realistic. Euripides, in fact, does not rely a lot on the gods in many of his plays, even though they may be present. He's much more concerned with the way that humans themselves behave in extreme tragic situations. Also, Euripides will sometimes change stories around to make them a little bit more in line with the way he thought they should be. For instance, when you read Aeschylus tomorrow, the Oresteia, you will learn that Orestes' sister Electra comes out from the palace, where she's essentially being held prisoner by her maniacal mother Clytemnestra. She comes out in order to offer a prayer and a sacrifice at the tomb of her deceased father Agamemnon, the one that Clytemnestra, her mother, actually killed. And while she's there, she discovers footprints in the soil around the tomb, and also a lock of hair. And she becomes curious because they resemble her own, and she realizes, and then it is in fact confirmed, that this is the hair and the footprint of her deceased, thought to be deceased, brother Orestes, who is actually alive and has in fact returned from essentially an imposed exile in order to be able to rescue the household. Now in Aeschylus, that's presented in all of its very serious tragic overtones. Euripides, in one of his plays called Electra, completely tears that up. When the same tokens appear there, Electra, the character, says, "But that's ridiculous. I wouldn't have the same hair as Orestes. Orestes is a man and I'm a woman. And why would I have the same kind of footprint? Again, a woman's footprint would be smaller." There's also a clue about clothing that Orestes might have had as a child, and he says, why would he still have baby clothes? So Euripides really turns the whole very ennobled myth from Aeschylus's play on its head to basically say, this is absurd. In essence, Euripides is almost satirizing the art of tragedy. That again could be another reason why his plays might not have been always well received in Athens. And he'll do other things. He actually has Electra get married instead of single, the way that she's usually thought to be. He'll have Hecuba first abject outside of Troy. She was the queen of Troy and witnessed its destruction. But then she gets turned into a yapping bitch, to be again very blunt, in a different play also called Hecuba. Helen, instead of being spirited off to Troy, is spirited off to Egypt. A ghost goes off to Troy, and other kinds of things. So Euripides likes to experiment with the art of tragedy quite a bit, and again, at times it might not have been well received. We're also told by Aristophanes, the comic playwright, that Euripides gave the impression of debasing the art of tragedy. For instance, he dressed kings up in rags. He has to do that critically for one scene in a lost play. A man named Telephus is a king, but he has to sneak in unbeknownst, and so he's dressed up as a beggar. And so the idea of dressing a king to look awful instead of in a proper royal appearance is another thing that critics of the time apparently thought was rather bothersome about Euripides' tragedies. So in any event, though, Euripides' tragedies, you'll probably find, are among the most accessible for readers today, and they in fact were probably the most influential of all the three tragedians on later tragedy and comedy through we could say Renaissance and later Europe, and even plays today. So let me now spend a bit of time talking about Bacchae. Bacchae was your play for today, and as you see, you have the character of Dionysus, who was essentially away from his birth city of Thebes. He is now returning, and he has things to talk about with the Thebans, such as the fact that his name was besmirched by all of his aunts, who claimed that the story of his birth was actually a fake one, that it was just some affair on the side. He punishes the Thebans by first driving the women of the city out into the wilderness, which in fact would have been disastrous because the women essentially acted as the underpinning of society by taking care of various domestic tasks. So having them suddenly removed from their role and running rampant and amok everywhere would have really set the city on its ear, in essence. So when Pentheus responds by trying to squelch the worship of Dionysic rites, then Dionysus fixes himself on Pentheus, and as you see, the way he really gets to Pentheus, after of course tricking him in the guise of that stranger, is to get Pentheus to dress up as a woman. So in essence, what really happens to Pentheus in his Apolline demeanor of trying to be very rigid and hyper rational is that he is essentially emasculated. He's turned into a woman practically and dragged out into the realm of the women where they are all going crazy. And then when he is told to spy on the women, then the women turn on him on order of Dionysus with that voice that comes from the column of light that the messenger describes. Now the thing about that is that there is a concept in religion called the mystery cult. The mystery cult is a closed group of people who observe a particular religion or religious practice, worship of a god, and they have to be initiated into the cults. They cannot belong to it unless they are properly brought in. Anybody who is a member of that cult is not allowed to tell what's going on in it outside. That's actually what the term mystery means. It means to close the mouth and therefore not talk. So a mystery cult has to be kept secret. Now, if Pentheus is coming in as a woman, essentially foreign to this cult, watching the women, it's as if he is spying on something that he is not supposed to see. And Thebes, unfortunately, has a bit of a history of that because one of the other cousins of the family was the rather famous Actaeon. You may possibly have learned of him partly through this play and from your textbook, that Actaeon was the poor man who was hunting one day and stumbled upon Artemis bathing and had the misfortune to see her naked before her nymphs had an opportunity to cover her all up. And they really probably couldn't anyway because she would have probably towered over them. So when that happens, she immediately throws water in his face and he is turned into a stag. And then the punishment inflicted upon him is that his own hunting dogs go and hunt him down. So the concept of seeing something that one is not supposed to see is in fact endemic to Greek religion. And as a final point I'll make here on this, to wrap up this play, is that if somebody is not able to enter a shrine, that person is compelled to stand outside of it because the person is not allowed to go inside. So in Latin, the word for in front of something is pro, P-R-O. The word for a shrine is famnum. And so if a person is in front of the shrine, the person is profano. In other words, profane. And that is where the word profane comes from. It means somebody who is not able to share in a particular religious practice. So the play wraps up with punishment coming down from Dionysus on the previous king of Thebes, Cadmus, the one who actually founded Thebes, and his wife Harmonia. They had been attempting to worship Dionysus, but they did it in an excessively cautious way. Like, we'll do it even if we really shouldn't, because we don't really know whether he's a god or not. He will not accept that. And so, ironically, they get turned into snakes. Because remember that Cadmus, as founder of Thebes, in fact had to kill a serpent, just like Apollo, remember, also had to kill a serpent in order to get to Delphi. Cadmus had to do the same thing, and then he sewed the dragon's teeth from that serpent in order to found the city of Thebes. So he's connected with a serpent, and then ends up also eventually turned back into a serpent himself. So Bacchae is a very punishing, very blunt play. It's really one of the greatest ones that we have, and it very deservedly won first place, and it's unfortunate that Euripides was not there to see it. But it is a spectacular play. It captures a lot of the basic elements that you can see in action for a tragedy. The prologue, the main character, the angry god, the chorus there trying to comment, trying to warn the tragic hero Pentheus of what he's doing wrong, the fatal flaw that Pentheus is too hyper-rational, too stuck in his ways to realize that he needs to adopt, the violation of the god's precepts. And then also, in the case of Euripides, the real commentary on human nature. Because if Pentheus is objectionable because he will not bend for Dionysus, we can't exactly be thrilled with Dionysus either, because the way that he'll come in and destroy this whole city completely with absolutely no mercy whatsoever doesn't really speak well for the god either. And in fact, we see that happen quite a lot in Greek tragedy, where gods really act outside of what we would consider proper bounds for dealing with a particular situation. Well, thank you very much for listening in on this. We have one last video for today, July 13th, and that is the presentations that you'll need to complete tomorrow, next Monday, and next Tuesday. So stay tuned here so that I can describe these to you. See you in a moment.